All right, so the main point of this week's topic is to give you some tools so that you can evaluate the effect of tariffs. And you want to be able to analyze the effect of tariffs on trade patterns and on the distribution of income within a country. And then I hope we'll also have time. These same tools can be used to analyze different policy questions, and one of those is the opposite of a tariff, which is an export subsidy, which actually do exist in real life. So I hope we'll get a chance to look at some of those too. Now these tools, this is a good time to have it before the midterm because it's kind of accumulation of all the models we've done on comparative advantage. What were they again? The Ricardian model. Okay, this introduced the intuition or the main idea behind comparative advantage. The specific factors model, which helped us to understand how trade affects the distribution of income and why some groups may be strongly in support of trade and some groups may be very, very against trade. And then the model that we did last week, the Heckscher-Ohlin model, which gave us tools to look at the long-run consequences of trade and what happens when there are changes in resource endowments to the distribution of income within a country. All right, this is what we've done so far. So we're going to kind of build on all those tools and use it to look at the effect of tariffs. Now, there's going to be a few new terms that we'll use today, and I want to just introduce those terms first, and we'll come back to them. So the new concepts or terms are one, indifference curves. I hope that sounds familiar from your microeconomics course. Basically, this is a graphical tool to represent consumer preferences. Okay. Terms of trade, which I'll tell you right now what that is. That is simply the ratio of the price of a country's export good to the price of a country's import good. And then import tariffs, you may think you already know what a tariff is, but just to be crystal clear, a tariff is a tax that is levied on an import. So, for example, in Japan, the most famous tariff is the tariff on rice. Every time rice comes into Japan, 800% of its value the government takes as a tax. Okay? That's an import tariff. All right, now as a thought experiment, I want you to go back a long time ago to when Japan was in autarky. Do you remember what that means by now? What's autarky mean? No trade. Japan is one of the few examples we have of really true autarky and at the same time a very well-developed market economy that has like prices, market prices. Okay. So go back to 1635 when the so-called Sakoku edicts were issued and Japan is no longer allowed to have any kind of trade. Now, there was, and I know somebody's going to say it, maybe you, there was a little bit of trade with who? China and the Netherlands, okay? But it was very, very small. It was on this little strip of land, you know, in Nagasaki, and it was very, very small. Within a few years after the edicts, it was less than 0.5% of Japan's GDP. So Japan is the closest thing we have in real life to autarky, and it was pretty close. Okay, it was pretty close. All right, so let's go back to the period of Sakoku, 1635. All right, and think about Japan. Now, but as I said, the really great thing for researchers is Japan was an autarky, completely closed to trade, but it had a very vibrant, well-developed market economy. All right, what does a market economy do? A market economy maximizes the value of its production, okay? So our market economy maximizes the value of its production when it produces on its production possibility frontier at the point that just barely touches, and that means is just tangent to, the highest possible ISO value line. All right, now what does that look like in an equation? This is an equation for our ISO value line, and this describes the value of total output in our two-output, two-good world, okay? So this is the price of clothing or cloth times the quantity of cloth produced plus the price of food times the quantity of food produced. And here's what I want you to picture in this world, you know, back in the mid-1600s in Japan. Cloth is going to be silk, and food is going to be rice, okay? Now, we rearrange this equation to represent it in terms of the quantity of food. And that allows us to draw this ISO value line, the value of production, on our graph, which I'll show you in just a second. Okay? This is the intercept, and this is the slope of that line. So the slope of the ISO value line is the negative ratio, or negative the ratio price of silk, or price of cloth. Okay? Or the slope is the absolute value of the relative price of silk. Right? And again, as review, let me show you a picture. So that's an equation. Here's a picture. All right, so here's our economy's production possibility frontier using its inputs. This is what it can produce. Where will it produce? Well, it'll produce right here at that point Q1. Okay? Why? Because that's the point that is just tangent to or just barely touches the highest possible ISO value line. Okay, and review again. As you know, as we move away from the origin, the ISO value lines are getting higher in value. They all have the same slope because they all have the slope that's the relative price of silk or cloth. Okay. We can produce here. We can produce here. Why do we not? Because we can also produce here, and that has a higher value of our output. Okay. Why do we not produce up here? We cannot because it's beyond the production possibility frontier. We just can't do that with our allocation of resources. Okay? So this is where we will produce. Okay, I see you all nodding, so you remember this, right? This is review. All right, so you remember production choices are determined by the economy's production possibility frontier and the prices of the output. What about consumption? What determines consumption? Well, consumption is also determined by prices. And we're going to introduce a new tool here that we haven't used before, which is consumer preferences. How are consumer preferences going to be shown? By using this new curve called an indifference curve. Right, so indifference curves are a mathematical, but we'll just look at it graphically, tool that economists have come up with to show combinations of bundles of goods, combinations in this case of silk and rice or clothing and food, at which our consumers are indifferent. That means they make them equally happy, they make them equally satisfied. They give them equal utility is the word we usually use. Okay. So utility kind of is economists speak for happiness. All right, so they're indifferent. It means they feel the same anywhere on one given indifference curves. What do indifference curves look like? They look like this. Why do they look like that? So let me explain in words what this means. One is, as I already have written here, and I think it's easier to see on the graph, just like the ISO value lines, the further an indifference curve is from the origin, the happier or more satisfied or more utility our consumers have. So you want to be on the one that's furthest from the origin, or the highest one, the highest indifference curve. Okay, so that's one trait about indifference curves. Farther from the origin represents higher utility. What else? They're downward sloping. Why? So if our consumers have more cloth or silk, they're happier. They're equally happy with a little bit less food or a little bit less rice. Okay, so they're downward sloping, but they're not, sloping down with a slope of 1. They're bowed. Why are they kind of bowed? They sort of flatten as we move to the right because as consumers have more cloth and less food, a little bit more food becomes more valuable, right? I mean, having all the silk in the world isn't going to make you happy. You need to have a little bit of rice. So that food makes you a little happier as you get more and more cloth. So that's why they look that way. And then here's one thing that we haven't looked at so far, but is actually true mathematically. It's that at this point Q1 that I just showed you, and you already knew, maximize the value of this economy's production, it's also maximizing consumers' utility. Because actually at that point, the production possibility frontier is tangent to or just touches the ISO value line, and it's also tangent to or just touches the highest possible indifference curve. All right, so consumers would like to have more of both, but they can't. This economy can't produce it with its resource endowments. All right, so are we all okay with this? This is Japan with no trade. This is Japan from 1635 until the mid-1800s for more than 200 years. Okay, so Japan's producing, let's say at this point Q1, silk and rice. Then what happens? Do you know what happens? Do we have any history majors? Okay, then Commodore Perry shows up. Okay? So he shows up with 3 very intimidating, big, apparently black ships, well armed, and says, we would like you to open up to trade, and we'll be back with even more guns in about 3 years and have you sign this trade treaty. And so Japan went almost overnight, I mean, it was a few years actually, but almost overnight, Japan went from complete autarky, almost no trade, to having almost completely open free trade. Now, what do you think happened when Japan opened up almost overnight to free trade? Actually, you already know. You already have the tools to answer that question. All right, so remember that under free trade, I went backwards by accident. So under free trade, under autarky first. So under no trade, what determines the relative price of silk? It's determined by, relative supply and relative demand, but within Japan, right? So Japan has to produce everything it wants to consume because it hardly trades at all. There's almost no trade. And prices are determined by free markets, but those free market prices are determined by supply and demand only within Japan, right? Okay. Now, Japan opens up to free trade, and all of a sudden, prices are determined by not domestic supply and demand, but world supply and demand. And what does that look like? Well, we kind of know because we have some historical data. So it turns out that Japan had a much higher relative supply of silk than the rest of the world. And if you remember back to, in fact, I think it was even the first comparative advantage model we did, the Ricardian model, you know that when we go from autarky to free trade between 2 countries, so let's think of the US, for example, the equilibrium price is somewhere in between the 2 autarky prices. Does that sound familiar? Okay. So if Japan had a relatively higher supply of silk to rice than the new free trade trading partner, the US, we know what will happen to prices. Think for a minute. Do you know? What will happen to prices? Okay. You know. It looks like this. So if we go from autarky to free trade, all of a sudden prices are determined by relative supply of the world, which is a little bit lower than Japan's domestic relative supply of silk. So what does that do to the equilibrium relative price of silk? Do you see? What should happen to the price of silk when they go from autarky to free trade? The relative price of silk should go up. And you know what happened? It went up. It doubled. It increased 100% within a few years. All right, so what happens? How would this nearly 100% increase or rise in the relative price of silk affect this economy, which is Japan's production? How would Japan's production be affected by that price rise? You should already know. Do you know what will happen? Yeah, how'd you think? Okay, you thought that through pretty quickly. Yeah, let's show how Yuma got that answer. Okay, so we start out here. We're happily in autarky, let's say. Okay, maximizing the value of production at point Q1, and all of a sudden we go from autarky to completely free trade. The relative price of silk doubles or increases 100%. That changes the slope of that ISO value line. Do you know which way it increases it, changes it? It makes it steeper, a lot steeper. Right, so now it looks like that. So now at our new relative prices, where the relative price of silk is much, much higher, that economy will maximize the value of its production, not at Q1, but at Q2, which has, as Yuma said, much more silk production and much less rice production, much less food or rice production. All right. So after opening up to free trade, this economy, which is Japan, in the mid-1800s, it produces now at point Q2, which is where the production possibility frontier just barely touches or is just tangent to that ISO value line, the new ISO value line with the new slope based on the new prices. Where does this economy consume? So this is kind of a new question, but actually you already have all the tools to answer it. So remember that under autarky, the economy can only consume what it produces, right? Because there's no trade. So if you want something, you have to make it yourself. But under free trade, consumption is no longer limited to be exactly the same as production. So under free trade, that economy can produce at that new point Q2 that now maximizes the value of production, but it can trade that production at the new prevailing world prices. So our relative price of silk, superscript 2, which is doubled, it can trade it and consume a bundle or a mixture of silk and rice that is different than what it produces. It doesn't have to consume exactly what it produces. It can consume something different. But it can't just consume whatever it wants to, right? So consumption is constrained. We have a budget constraint. Consumption, the value of total consumption, has to be equal to the value of total production. So what does that look like? We're going to denote consumption with a D, and production will still be Q, like it always has been. And so all that means is that the price of clothing or silk cloth, let's say, times the consumption of cloth or silk, plus the price of rice or food times the consumption of rice or food, has to equal this. And does that look familiar? That's the equation for the ISO value line. That's the value of production. So the value of production has to equal the value of consumption, and the value of production we already know because that's that ISO value line that helped us define the production point in the first place. So essentially, this economy produces at Q2, which maximizes the value of production at the new prices, and then it can trade that bundle at the prevailing world prices and consume anywhere on that ISO value line. Now, is that good or bad? Well, you kind of, yeah. Yes,
when we look
yes.
at the quantities, we can also reach higher quantity
Yes. So both of those are completely correct. And what you already knew is the second part of what Evelyn said, which is that, well, we know that under free trade, our public consumers can now consume more of both goods. So by economist definition, you're happier, okay? But we have a new tool now that she mentioned, which is the indifference curve, to kind of try to measure that a little bit more accurately. All right, so now we're at the new prevailing world prices. The price of silk has doubled. And look, consumption will now be, instead of consumption having to be at production Q1, we're in free trade, so we can produce here at Q2, we can trade it at world prices, and we can consume here at D2, which puts us on a higher indifference curve, which means our consumers have higher utility, which is sort of like saying they're happier. So this is the same message you've been getting with all these comparative advantage models. Free trade makes you happier. Free trade increases welfare of the country as a whole. Free trade is sort of a good thing. Okay? It's possible, at least, to make everybody better off under free trade. Now, here's a new question for you that I think you can answer if you look at this. Look at this graph for a minute. What good does this economy so this is free trade Japan, what good does this economy import and export? Do you know? You can read it off the graph, actually. All right, so here's where we're producing, Q2. Here's where we're consuming, D2. Yeah?
And we are exporting clothes because we're producing more clothes than we demand, and we import food because we demand more food than we produce.
Yes, yes, yes. So this is what should happen theoretically. We're producing here, we're consuming here, and that means that we import rice. I chose rice on purpose because I thought intuitively it might be a little hard for you to say that. And we export silk. And that sounds right. Actually, you know what happened? So Japan is in autarky. Japan opens up to free trade. The price of silk doubles. And within a few years, 35% of Japan's exports were silk, and 35% of Japan's imports were rice and vegetable oil and sugar and soybeans. So this really happened in a sense. And Japan is one of the few countries for which you can get this kind of data and actually look at autarky, free trade, and see what happened. And it very much supports the comparative advantage kind of models. So 35% of Japan's exports were silk, and about 35% of Japan's imports were food. All right, now most of this, with the exception of the indifference curves, has been review, or at least using tools that you already know from our other comparative advantage models. Okay, so now let's do something new with these tools. So Japan has gone from autarky to free trade. Now Japan decides to put a tariff on rice. Okay. What happens when we put a tariff on rice? What is the effect of tariffs in this model? So a reminder of what tariffs are. Tariffs are taxes that are levied or taken by the government on imported goods. All right, so import tariffs, here's what they really do. They drive a wedge. Remember this, anytime you get a question about the effect of a tariff, always think of this first. What do tariffs do? Tariffs drive a wedge between prices in world markets or external markets and domestic prices, or prices in the internal market. And that affects the terms of trade. All right, what are the terms of trade? The terms of trade, well, I shouldn't say it affects the terms of trade. It sometimes affects the terms of trade. If it's a big country, it affects the terms of trade. All right, so that's what we're going to look at today. What are the terms of trade? The terms of trade are the relative value of a country's exports to a country's imports. And since exports and imports are traded in world markets, when we talk about the terms of trade, we're talking about the external or world price of exports to imports. But what the tariff does is drive a wedge between that external or world price and the domestic or internal price. So if our domestic country, and here we're thinking about Japan, imposes a tariff on food imports, for example, an 800% tariff on rice, okay, one of the biggest in the world, what happens is that the price of food relative to the price of cloth that domestic citizens or people living in Japan face, it's higher than the relative world price of food. Right? You sort of know that, right? I mean, you've heard we pay much more for rice than the rest of the world, okay, or most of the rest of the world. And likewise, at the same time, because it's a too-good model, the price of cloth, or in this example, silk, relative to the price of food or rice that domestic citizens pay is going to be lower than the world relative price of silk or cloth. Now, here's the main reason we usually have for tariffs. and that is to change the distribution of income within a country, right? So this you already know. But because of the changes in relative prices, import tariffs have effects on income distribution among producers within a country. Who benefits from import tariffs? The domestic import competing industry. So who benefits from the 800% tariff on rice? It would be rice farmers, okay, or anybody who produces rice. Why? Because this is sometimes tricky, so make sure you understand this. Why does it benefit the rice farmers? Because if no rice can come in without an 800% tariff taken on it, then domestic rice producers can charge a price for their rice that's 800% higher. Does that make sense? 'Cause they don't have any competition at lower prices. So they can raise the price that they charge for their rice, and consumers have to pay a higher price for rice. The other thing that it does, and this is also probably one of the most important motivations for this high tariff that Japan has, is that it shifts resources away from the export sector, which in this example is silk, and into the import competing sector, which in this example is rice. Have you heard that argument? That's one of the more, I think, convincing, persuasive, and honest arguments for this huge tariff on rice is that Japan wants to have its own food supply, right? So they want to divert more resources into rice production, for example. So the EU, the US, and Japan all have high tariffs on agricultural goods. And there are probably two real authentic reasons for that. One is farmers have a strong lobby and they want to redistribute income toward farmers because they have a strong lobby. And two is, perhaps all three have a national security issue in mind, that they want to have their own domestic source of food, right? I think especially in Japan that's very strong. You can ask some older people who lived through the post-World War II period and couldn't find any food. So it's a real concern. But let's go beyond that reality and let's get back to our model, okay? So in our model, what happens to supply and demand for our goods? Well, if the country is big, and what is big? Well, I mean big enough that it affects world relative supply and world relative demand. So if it's big, a domestic import tariff may influence world relative supply and world relative demand, and therefore it can affect prices. Okay? Who's big? I don't really know that today any country is really big enough to do this in reality. But if anybody's big, it's going to be like China, the US, Japan, Germany, countries that have big GDP and are very active on world trade markets. Okay? And in the case, well, make a clear assumption about whether your country is big or not, because that changes the whole answer. Right? But if it's a big economy, putting on a tariff may affect relative supply and relative demand in the external world market, and that can affect prices. So we start out here. Now look carefully at the notation here. All right? So I've got relative supply and relative demand, but this is our second equilibrium. So this is not Japan under autarky. This is after Japan is opened up to trade, but before a tariff. So this is the second point. What happens if Japan puts on a tariff? Okay, well, with a tariff on food or rice, domestic Japanese producers can get a higher relative price of rice or food. And that means a lower relative price of silk or cloth. And that means producers will be more willing to shift into food or rice production. If Japan is big, a big economy, and it may well be, that will shift the relative supply curve. Do you know which way it will shift the relative supply curve? You have to look carefully at the axis. So if more producers shift into rice or food and out of silk or cloth, it'll shift our relative supply curve to the left because of the way the axes are drawn. Okay. And something might also happen to the demand curve. all right? With a tariff on food, domestic consumers, all right, that's us, we have to pay a higher relative price of food or rice. And that means in our two-good world that we pay a lower relative price of cloth or silk. And therefore, to some extent, we're going to be more willing to switch to silk or cloth consumption. So the relative demand curve will shift. Do you know which way the demand curve will shift? Well, again, you have to look carefully at the axis. But if we're shifting out of rice or food consumption and into silk or cloth consumption, that shifts the relative demand curve to the right. So we were already in free trade at point 2. If we put a tariff on food imports, and if we're a big country, we will shift relative supply and relative demand, and we will cause a change, in fact, in world prices. And what's happened to world prices? Well, we've had, again, a big increase in the relative price of silk or cloth. All right, and the next question is, well, what happens when we have an increase in the relative price of silk or cloth due to a tariff? And in fact, you already have all the tools to analyze that question, and we reviewed them at the start of this discussion. But let me show you what it looks like. And this is the standard model of trade. All right, this is sort of putting together all the different comparative advantage models we've been working on so far. All right, so we already know how an increase in the relative price of cloth or silk will affect the economy's choice of production. What it does is we start out here at Q2. Now, this is not autarky. We've gone from autarky to free trade already. We're at Q2. But then, thanks to the tariff, if we're a big economy and we affect relative supply and relative demand, we affect the new world relative price of silk or cloth. And that makes this ISO value line even steeper. And that pushes us even more into specialization towards silk and away from production of rice. Okay, now this assumption is very important. This might not be what you think happens from a tariff, and it's probably not really what policymakers intend, and it only happens if it's a big economy. But it's an important thing to understand, because it's one of the things that helps us understand why we see tariffs, even though 99.9% of economists think the world would be better off with free trade, and every country would be better off with free trade. Okay. We also already know what happens to the economy's choice of consumption when we have a rise in the price of silk, because we already looked at that as well. So we were producing here under free trade, and we were trading at world prices to consume here. Now the relative price of silk or cloth rises because of our tariff. We're a big economy. We shift world relative demand and supply. We make the relative price of silk even higher. That puts us at a different production point on a steeper ISO value line, but we still trade at those new, even higher relative price of silk, and we consume at D3, which, note here, this is the thing that's a little counterintuitive. It puts the economy or consumers on a higher indifference curve. Now, it puts us on a higher indifference curve, and it also, I hope you can see here, these graphs are a little bit hard to make super accurately, but can you see that we're also a little bit on a different point on the indifference curve? Okay, there are two effects going on here, the substitution effect and the income effect. All right, so if you look at this, look, graphically, we're consuming, I guess, more of both goods, so clearly we're better off. But there is a little bit of a substitution effect. So the substitution effect of a higher relative price of cloth, of course, makes consumers willing to buy less cloth and more food, right? So that does happen a little bit. And that's the shift along the indifference curve. But at the same time, the relative price of cloth has risen. This economy exports cloth or silk. So that means the terms of trade have improved. And that brings an income effect. And that's what you really see very starkly in the graph, is that we get on a higher indifference curve thanks to the income effect. So the thing to remember is that the substitution effect moves the economy kind of a little bit along that indifference curve, and the income effect is shifting us from one indifference curve to a higher one. Okay. So there are two effects going on. And if you look at the graph again after I've said that, I wonder if you'll be able to see a little bit better. So clearly we've gone on to a higher indifference curve, but also we've moved a little bit along that indifference curve. So I tried to draw these parallel, and we've moved a little bit along, and that's due to the substitution effect. Okay, now remember, what are the terms of trade? The terms of trade are the price of exports relative to the price of imports. So if our country is a cloth or a silk exporter, which it is, okay, and the relative price of cloth or silk rises, again, because of this tariff, well, the terms of trade for this economy have increased or improved. We say the terms of trade have improved because the relative price of the export good has risen. An increase in the terms of trade or an improvement in the terms of trade raises the economy's welfare. Now, that should surprise you a little bit because the whole course I've been telling you quite blatantly, free trade is good. Why is free trade good? It increases the welfare of the economy as a whole. There may be some winners and losers, but we could compensate the people who are hurt, and still everyone could be better off. I've been telling you that almost every class, right? And now I'm showing you a tariff, which is not free trade, and saying that it increases the economy's welfare. So let me close with this question. Am I saying that tariffs are a good thing? And the answer has to be sort of a qualified yes. What this model does is it shows you that when a country imposes a tariff, the terms of trade may improve and the welfare of the country may increase. It might happen. There are a couple of qualifications, though. One is that whether that happens at all and the magnitude of this effect depends on the size of the economy. It has to be a very big economy to do this. So if the country is a small part of the world economy, if it's a small country, then its tariff or conversely subsidy policies will not really have much effect on world supply and world relative demand or the terms of trade. And so this possibly good or welfare improving tariff really only exists for big countries. And I think you see that in sort of global discussions about trade. It's always the big countries who want to keep on tariffs, and it's usually the small countries who want free trade. So in our two country, two good model, this predicts that an import tariff by the domestic country, it can possibly increase domestic welfare at the expense of the trading partner. Right? In this example, it would be Japan versus the US. And this may be one reason that we see not that many, but still more tariffs than economists think we should have. I mean, tariffs have come down to almost zero on manufactured goods, but we still see them quite a lot on agricultural goods. And this may be one reason. Maybe this terms of trade argument is one reason why we still see tariffs, even though almost no economists think we should have tariffs or impediments to trade. But one thing to note is that, one, I don't have it written up here, but I already said it earlier. This is usually not the main reason, right, for a tariff. The main reason for a tariff is to redistribute income and resources within the country. Okay, so there's a domestic reason for it. And two, even this standard model of trade, which is saying that there's a terms of trade improvement from the tariff, we're assuming here no retaliation. So Japan can slap on an 800% tariff on rice, and nobody else retaliates by putting, I don't know, a tariff on silk, for example. Okay? And in the real world, that's not how the world works. All right. But I do want you to understand this, and I guess we won't have time to do our case study today. Well, let me think about that. But I want to have you apply this either today or maybe next time we meet to think about how you could use this argument to make an argument for a tariff. Okay. And then I have an appendix here. And most of the appendix is just for people who are a little bit interested in extensions of this. But I would recommend that you take a look at export subsidies. Okay, they're basically the opposite of a tariff, and the effects of this are pretty much the opposite. So let me see, I'll feel how well you did on the case study and then see whether we need to go into this in class. But I'd really like to give you a case on an export subsidy too and see how you do. So I wonder, well, yeah, let's try this case since some of you came having read it and I have it ready. We'll not go over to the ILC today and we'll do the case here in class and see how it goes. And then I can decide what we'll do on Friday and what we'll do next week. So I can't officially give you a break for Super 4, but take a few minutes and get in a group, okay? I would recommend like 3, 4, 5 people. Okay, you're going to get in a group. Then I'm going to read you the question. If you really want to practice a real case, don't read it, just listen, okay? So if you didn't prepare for class, that is fine. That's more authentic, let's say. So I'll read it to you, and I'm going to ask while you're all together for somebody to summarize the question, verify the objective, ask some clarifying questions, lay out your assumptions and the kind of model you'll use, and then I'm going to give you time to work with those people you're sitting with and try to solve it, and we'll see if we can get some groups to kind of present, informally what their answer is. There's no right or wrong answer. There are right or wrongs about using the model, but there's no answer that's wrong or answer that's right as long as you support it, okay? So take a few minutes and get in a group of, I would say, 3, 4, 5 people who are around you that you want to work with for this case, and I'll get it opened up here. Okay. Let's review first. What are the steps in the case analysis? You remember what they are? So I will read you the question, summarize it. Summarize the question, and usually at the same time as do number 2, which is verify your objective. What are you supposed to do? All right, then let me add in a step that's not here. I will always give you what they call a laundry list of things to do. What do you do when I'm taking that list? You write down everything. Write down everything. And sometimes in a real case you get that too. All right, so take notes. It happens very often. You say, okay, so the client is so-and-so, our objective is so-and-so. Yes, and while you're doing that, I want you to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so when you answer, you have to make sure you do all 5. I always give you that. Why? Because I really want you to learn the model I taught you. So I want to make sure you know the answer to the questions that are in the model. Then you get a chance to ask clarifying questions. What you might be able to do in these cases that we do is you may be able to, instead of ask questions, just state out your assumptions and say, I assume X. Is that correct? I assume Y. Is that correct? So that's a better way to do it. Okay, then you say, all right, to answer this question, here's what I'll do. And you lay out your structure. Okay, and I want to make sure you all have the right structure before I let you go and do your work together. Okay, so you lay out your structure. And then once we have everybody on the same track with the structure, then you're going to go off in your groups and you're going to solve the case. And then we'll have you come back, and what I'd like you to practice doing is come back, and what do you do when you come back? You again summarize who was your client, what was your objective, and then give your clear answer. Okay? And it's very common here. I definitely want you to be, using the graphs and stuff. But it's also very common in a real case kind of question to use some kind of graphs. They're not as complicated as these that we're doing in class, but still, it's good to have some kind of graph or figure or something. Okay? All right, so you ready? Here's your question. I'm not going to show it immediately. Okay, our client is New Balance Athletic Shoe Incorporated, listed on the stock exchange as NBAS, New Balance Athletic Shoe Incorporated, an American footwear producer. New Balance is one of the few American footwear producers that actually manufactures its shoes in the United States, in Brighton actually, which is a suburb of Boston, Massachusetts. They report that about 1/4 of their shoes sold in the U.S. are still produced in the U.S. In fact, they employ about 1,300 factory workers in the United States. New Balance CEO, Robert Martin, is concerned about what will happen if the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations result in a successful treaty. Japan, the United States, and 10 other countries taking part in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, free trade negotiations, will hold a ministerial session in Sydney later this month. In fact, it's planned for October 25th through 27th. And they're aiming for a broad accord in November. A treaty would likely mean that U.S. tariffs on shoe imports from Vietnam, who's also involved in TPP, would be lifted. How should New Balance respond to the progress on TPP? Okay, ready? Who wants to summarize the question and verify the objective?
Our final is New Balance affected shoe fabrication, and then objective is it will help our client figure out what should New Balance respond to the progress on the TPP that if the TPP goes through.
Okay, it's a correct answer. I think you can do that without looking and making eye contact with me and speaking very loud. Just try one more time, okay? Just think for a minute. Just take a second before you say it. Okay, try one more time.
Our pilot is New Balance shoe cooperation, and our objective is to help our client figure out what should the company do if the TPP goes through.
Yes. And along the way, here comes your laundry list. Get ready. I want to know, 1, if there is a successful TPP treaty, what will happen to the relative price of athletic shoes, let's say relative to semiconductors? 2, what will happen to the overall welfare of the United States? And 3, I want you to support your answer with the standard trade model. Okay, did you all get that? So you wrote down the 3 things? Okay. Now, the next step is to ask clarifying questions. So what else do you need to know? Take a minute and think. Is there anything else you need to know? Or do you want to just assume it, state it as an assumption? Does anybody know what I'm fishing for? Okay, hold on a second. Let me take us up here. All right, so here's what I read. This is the case. Summarize the question, verify the objective. Okay, this is more or less what Becky said. And then I said yes, she's correct. Along the way, I want you to do 1, 2, 3, and you wrote those things down. Okay, so make sure you address those points in your answer. Write them down. So now we're up to clarifying questions. What else do we need to know?
Can I assume that the 2 countries that we're specifically looking at is the United States and Vietnam because of the tariffs?
Yes.
And also, are we also looking at, can I assume that we're looking at one that is a labor intensive, which is obviously shoes, and something else that is capital intensive, which I saw that with semiconductors, as an example of that. Can I assume that those 2 are?
Yes. Shoes are labor intensive. Semiconductors are capital intensive. Yes. And is there anything else you want to assume?
Let me assume that the U.S. have a comparative advantage in using semiconductors.
Yes. So the U.S. presumably has a comparative advantage in producing semiconductors. You're giving these in different orders than I planned. And what else? You need one more thing. What was the assumption in the standard trade model? To use it, we need to assume that the country was big. Who said that? Okay, big. What do you think? Are we talking about big countries here?
Yes.
U.S. and Vietnam? Who's big?
US is
Okay, so say that. So I'm going to assume the U.S. is a big
big.
economy.
I'm going to assume the US has a big economy.
And what do you mean by big? You mean, you know. What do you mean by big? What's he mean by big? What's a big economy? Okay, GDP is a good way to measure it. And in our model, it means big enough to do what? Yes, louder. Yes. Right, okay. So this is the order I thought you guys would say it. But you said everything in a different order. Okay, so first, I'm going to assume that the U.S. is a big economy, and by that I mean large enough to influence world relative supply and demand. Okay, and here's a graph to show that, yeah, okay, so U.S. assumption is more or less okay. If anybody's big, it's the U.S. We're going to assume that the U.S. has a comparative advantage in semiconductors relative to athletic footwear. That's what maybe Kiska said, I think. Yes, that's also correct. The U.S. is a net exporter of semiconductors. Annual exports of semiconductors are actually about 40 to 50 billion a year. And as a side note, they actually also import a lot of semiconductors, but we're going to get to a model like that later. So just pretend you don't know that. Okay. And finally, we're going to assume that the U.S. does not have a comparative advantage in producing footwear, but rather in semiconductors. And this is also a safe assumption. In fact, it's very hard to go out shopping and find a pair of athletic shoes that were actually produced in the U.S. Okay? So New Balance, I think it was Yusuke who mentioned this last time in our last case for Saucony. He said, well, I think they should make like a special line as like made in the USA. And in fact, New Balance did that. They made a USA collection that's produced by those 1,300 workers in Brighton. Okay? But basically, it's pretty hard to find a pair of shoes that were made in the U.S. Okay, so all those assumptions were correct. And let's see, maybe I don't want to show you anymore. All right, now what do you want to do next? You want to lay out your structure. Okay, so now you would say, okay, I'm going to take a few minutes to think about this, but I just want to make sure you're all on the right track. So how are you going to go about answering this question? What do you need? What kind of graph do you need? You need a relative supply and a relative demand graph. Did you know that? And you're just being quiet. Okay, so you need a relative supply, relative demand graph. And it's relative supply and relative demand for who? For the world. Okay? And you need to draw it in terms of shoes and semiconductors. Then you need to think through, very methodically, go back and look at your so-called laundry list of things, points that you got to address. You need to think about what happens to U.S. producers' incentives. What happens to U.S. consumers' incentives? What happens to the relative price of athletic shoes relative to what? Relative to semiconductors. Okay? What happens to the welfare of our U.S. citizens, or sort of welfare of the U.S. overall? And then, finally, here you get to be a little creative, okay? How do you want to advise your client, okay? How do you advise your client to respond to the TPP negotiations? And here there are links that will be there, how you might do that. Okay? So, now that we're sure you're on the right track, you say, I'm going to take a few minutes, just a few minutes, just write down some notes, and then you're going to come back with your answer. Now remember your answer. Regardless of what your answer is, you want to say it very loudly and confidently, like you know, okay? So why don't you do that right now? Here, I'll leave this up, the structure. Okay, these are the make sure you hit. Why don't you go and work with your groups for a few minutes and let's see what you can come up with. Sorry, when I say the tariff is lifted, I mean I'm using slang to say go on.
Oh,
No more tariff.
Okay, so
oh,
The
okay.
tariff that's there will be lifted away, not raised. I don't mean raised, sorry. So the tariff will, yeah, exactly. U.S. is a very important member of TPP. If there's a TPP treaty, they will not be allowed to keep that tariff. It's got to be gone.
じゃあ、消える。
そのアメリカの人たちってことで、まあ、人たち4分の1の雇用者にはそれは不利だけど、実際その違うこれと違うケースで日本の会社じゃなくてそういう体験の
Well, that's the thing. Probably, but you don't have to be constrained by that. Probably. But you can say that's an issue. I mean, my case is my opinion. In my opinion, the U.S. is making such a fuss about TPP. If they actually get signed. But Congress, on the other hand, Congress is not really going to do Congress is not really on board. Yes. Yeah, that may be about it. Congress is not. Okay, we've got about 15 minutes left. So do some groups have at least part of an answer they can give? Does anybody want to try? Let's try first, like just cold, and see what you can come up with. Anybody want to try? Yeah, you guys are kind of confident? Okay, you want to try? Okay. Anybody else want to try? Should I divide it up? How about this group back here? Yeah? Okay, let me try there, and I'll come back to you.
For the U.S. consumers, the price got lower and lower, so it's very good for the consumers. Because we are going to face a situation where American producers are slightly better off if they produce semiconductors because we have a comparative advantage there.
Did anybody have a different answer? Who didn't present? Did you guys have a different answer? Or a different graph? Did any of you, here's one thing. All right, I'm going to be mean on film. Actually, both answers are wrong. The graphical applying the model part is wrong. Why? Does anybody know why? What's wrong? What was wrong? Like what you said might be correct, okay? But your use of the standard model of trade was wrong. Does anybody know why? No? Maybe it's too hard to do it in the same day. Here's the thing. Let me give you a hint, and then we'll go over the answer next time, okay? So next time I'll give you what would be a correct like test kind of answer to at least the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points. Okay, for the last one, there's no right or wrong answer. Of the two groups that came up here, they did not label their axes. The death mistake in economics. Label your axes. You have to label your axes to even know which way the curve slope. What is this? What is that? So if you label your axes, I think it will help you a lot to get to the right answer. All right, so one is maybe you just learn this model, and it is a little bit hard to apply it right away. Okay, so maybe review the model a little bit. And what are we talking about here? So this is not supply and demand from microeconomics. This is relative supply and relative demand from international trade in a two-good, two-country, two-input world. Okay? So what is relative quantity? I mean, first of all, even in micro, I don't think you can just say Q, right? But it's relative supply of something to something. What are the two goods? Semiconductors and shoes, right? And relative price has to be something, semiconductors and shoes. And you have to work it out. What's the numerator? What's the denominator? What slopes what way? And let me give you a little hint, and then we'll work through it together next time. This is what it should look like. Does anybody know? Like what would, okay, suppose this is price of semiconductors over price of shoes. So this is a relative price of semiconductors, okay? Then this would be relative quantity. What should this be? Quantity of semiconductors. Now what is this Q semiconductors? That's quantity of semiconductors where?
No, I have a question. Were we looking at the relative price of shoes?
Well, the relative price of semiconductors is the relative price of shoes. So you could write it the other way, and then you could flip your quantities either way.
So the outcome would be the same.
As long as you keep track of what you're doing and you do everything, if you do it right, correctly, the outcome will be the same. We also need the quantity of semiconductors in foreign, which in this case is Vietnam, okay, over that same thing in shoes, plus the quantity of shoes in Vietnam. Did any groups have something that looked like this? No? Kind of? Okay, how about we'll do this next time? So next time we'll do the same case, okay, but I'm going to give you the tool and the labels for the axis and see if you can work it out. And that'll be a good review of the standard model of trade, okay? So we'll do this case one more time next time. Okay, all right, so I'll see you on Friday.